Welcome into a new edition of BWI Live. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle from Blue White Illustrated. It's February 19th. The college football world is in a dead period for recruiting, but there's a lot of recruiting news. Not that we'll get to really on today's show. That'll be tomorrow on BWI Live. But there's a lot of other things to talk about as Penn State rolls through its offseason. Of course, James Franklin has some hires to make and hires to still make. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But T. Frank, it is February, the middle of February. It is an interesting time. You and I were talking offline a little bit. Interesting time in the college football world because everyone is navigating the post-12-team college football playoff for the first time. Yeah. And for some teams, that doesn't mean a whole lot, including the ones that did not make the college football playoff and also the ones who went out in the first round. Their season ended a little bit earlier than expected. Even the teams in the quarterfinals probably don't feel too differently, considering most of those teams are New Year's Six teams anyway. But for the teams that made the semifinal and, of course, the final, longer than they've ever played a college football season, of course. And so some things that usually are taking place by now, like, winter workout winners of the day from Penn State or updated roster, which we're going to talk about in a bit, are a little bit behind. So it's an interesting time of year that's being filled mostly by recruiting right now. But also, there's still a very obvious reality to the fact that Penn State sits about a month away from spring practice, even though it's about a month away from the 2024 season ending.
It's interesting going through this for the first time. Like, you can conceptually understand certain things, but until you do it, like, it doesn't really register the same way. And so, for me, like, that's the way I experience the world. The conceptually is fine, but like, I have to live it to really get it. And the differences between a bowl game and like this playoff format is just, it's a different world because, from the perspective of a bowl game, the season ends, right? And Penn State has like, they go into their off-season mode kind of during, there's more time off. And then you prepare for the bowl game leading into the game. And then the season is over and you transition around January 1st, right? All of December, all of January, they were playing football the whole time. That is just so different, and it makes the season almost 6 months long. It changes the way I feel about football. Like, we are so much closer to football year-round in this model than we have ever been, and that is just wild. And I understand people pushing back on the need of spring football in those situations, and it's like this time of year has been truncated and is a very dead period at the moment, but it's not. It doesn't feel as long as it has in the past, right?
Yeah, it is not as far away to the return of football as it is most years. We're excited about that. Christian, we're excited you're with us here on the BWI Live Show. Thanks, as always, for showing up. Let's see what else is going on in the comments. Danny, good morning. Thanks for being here with us. Thanks to all of you here. And a reminder, if you want to be like Christian and like Danny, as T. Frank reminded you in the chat earlier, always like and subscribe to the channel and also leave a comment because as you hear on the post-game show, which I don't know how many days we are away from that one, T. Frank, the first one on August 30th, 2025, but it's under 200. I know that for sure. So as T. Frank always tells you there, you drive the show. So if you have anything you want us to try and get to during a BWI Live episode, let us know in the comments, and we will do our best to do so. We're going to get into some roster updates and some thoughts on how the 2025 Penn State offense could look under the direction of second-year offensive coordinator Andy Kotelnicki. But first, T. Frank, a housekeeping item to clean up. If you would have been able to find betting odds on Penn State finding and announcing its new running backs coach almost, 4 days before Notre Dame officially announced JaJuan Seider as its new running backs coach, it would have been Notre Dame would have been heavily favored to make that announcement first, but not every university, of course, employs the same employment process for hiring, things like that. But it is now official as of, about 1 o'clock Tuesday afternoon, February 18th. Notre Dame announced that JaJuan Seider is its new running backs coach, as you've heard endlessly, both at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com and here on the BWI YouTube channel. Title that goes with that is Associate Head Coach. much. And I know that for most people, they could care less about any of this. But for the few that do, that's a title that Terry Smith has held for a number of seasons at Penn State. JaJuan Seider was the assistant head coach. So, I'm sure, as we always talk about here, more money, more responsibility comes with that title. As Football Scoops reported, it was expected to be a 7-figure deal for JaJuan Seider. So, lateral move is what I think some people will refer to it as. I look at it maybe a little bit more in the direction of what James Franklin talked about with Khalil Ahmad, who there was a recruiting coordinator at Penn State, now the associate general manager at Temple. Again, what that means, it changes program to program. And certainly JaJuan Seider did not step up the ladder to call plays or to lead a program. But I think he definitely either got more money, more responsibility, or both. And either way, it doesn't really matter because he is out. And after 7 years, a good 7 years at Penn State, and Stan Drayton is him.
But I think that's the point, though, is that it's about the money here. It is about a change of scenery and all those things, and you don't do these things just for the money. But you're not going just to end. JaJuan Seider wasn't leaving for any old reason. That roster, really good running back roster at Notre Dame, a quality unit to coach that's currently on the roster. And, their running back recruiting has been very good. And also the money. If Terry Smith has that, these are all justifications. You get a title bump and a pay raise with the assumed new responsibilities. But really, if you're a coach, you're doing everything anyway. You're doing as much as you can. There's no more time in JaJuan Seider's day to do more things.
Right.
It's more about what's the justification to give you more money. And that opportunity was open at Notre Dame, and at Penn State, it was what it was. I'm sure they probably tried to counter offer, but it likely wasn't as much. And given all the things that we've talked about at the Blue White Illustrated message board and here on the show, there's your answer, right? The associate head coach, the pay bump, all those things are part of the decision-making process of okay, if it was time for me to move on and here's this opportunity and more money, it makes sense. It makes sense now, given what they're investing into JaJuan Seider at Notre Dame.
Yes. So that bit of housekeeping is now official. Penn State does still have to replace Khalil Ahmad on its recruiting staff, by the way. Could see some more analyst movement, but obviously it looks like James Franklin's latest coaching staff, at least the 10 assistant coaches, we can't call them on-field coaches anymore because everyone's an on-field coach at this point with the way the analyst rule works. But those 10 that are your de facto, you can't even call them the on-the-road coaches anymore because there's ways around that now too. So the 10 assistant coaches is the terminology we'll go with. Looks like it is all set now for James Franklin as he enters 2025 with one of the top-ranked teams in the country. And again, we're going to get into how that offense might look for the top 5 Nittany Lions, number 1 Nittany Lions, depending on which way too early preseason poll you look at. But first, let's take a look back at something we learned late last week. The Penn State roster was updated. Not anything new in terms of heights, weights, those types of things you've heard T. Frank and I and Nate and Sean talk about on the show here before on the BWI YouTube channel, but a deletion of the guys who have moved on and the addition of some newcomers. One newcomer in particular made headlines with the number he will wear. We will get to that here in just a little bit. But let's start with this. You had some weights you wanted to point out, T. Frank, some newcomer weights that were relevant to this conversation. So Penn State welcomed a double-digit number of early enrollees. Those guys are now on the roster, which you can read about over at bluewhiteillustrated.com. But let's talk first about what those early enrollee numbers meant to you as you perused the new Penn State roster for 2025.
Yeah, so these are the same numbers, I believe, just kind of like the other player weights on the roster. They're not indicative of where these guys have gone since signing day. They're the same weights and heights and things like that. But it does give you a starting point, right? And it gives you to see them comparatively to their peers at the given positions. I think that this is a good starting point for here are guys that are on the roster, and among those who have a starting position that puts them on a path towards, they can handle Big Ten football in 2025. So that's kind of who I was picking out from this list. And we don't know if this is good weight, right? So some of these guys, maybe they need to shed some pounds. Maybe they need to put on different weight. But I think the guy that stands out to me right away, Randy Adarica at 285, if that is a good weight, I don't know that he is in that position of Zane Durant to be able to participate right away from a skills perspective. What I'm saying is he's not maybe the same profile of recruit coming in, but he certainly is big enough. Like at 285, Zane Durant's 288. So if we're just going by raw size, he has the raw size right now on that listed weight. Again, that's a part of the conversation of what's good weight, what's bad weight. But I would say that that's an interesting one. And then not that they're going to need him, but Michael Troutman coming in at 285, being about 6'1". We got to see him. He's one that I did get to see kind of in a little bit more detail during those playoff practices. And I got to tell you, it looks like all pretty good weight. That kid is really well put together at 285. Again, has to get bigger. Like that's not a weight on this offensive line you're going to play at. But like it's a great starting point, I guess, is why I put him on this list. If it's a really good starting point. And then the other guy that I want to highlight here is Darius Dixon. If there is a player that I think is a dark horse to contribute this upcoming season, there are players in front of him. We talked to AJ Belgrave Shorter last week.
Yeah.
But Darius Dixon already played that nickel role in high school for Mater Dei. I know that they're going to try him out at corner. Like he's going to start out at corner, and they're going to see if he can play outside. We've already had conversations about maybe some of the long speed with him in his recruiting profile. But to me, if you're saying like who's a ready-made guy that could gain 5 to 7 pounds, be physical enough, and have the instincts and the anticipation and be on that path to playing early, Darius Dixon, there is an opportunity with a new defensive coordinator and his skill set to sneak into that safety room and take that nickel corner position, that slot safety position, because I think size is important. I think they want to play more often than not with 3 safeties. And you look at what Zion Tracy did, and he's going to be a part of the conversation. He's going to be a part of the roster. He's going to play. They're not going to do as much with 3 pure safeties. They're going to play nickel corners, and it's going to be a little bit more by platoon, I think, because that's just how Penn State does things as opposed to other places. But when it comes to the base defense and what they want, there's a long-term and a short-term, and I think he kind of fits into both. Now, again, he's going to have to jump a couple guys, but I think it's a great starting point for him.
Yeah, and I think this freshman class is going to be one that is fascinating because you look back to the media day we had with some Penn State second-year players earlier this month, and I think we talked about it last week, but just to reiterate, the one thing we heard more than anything else from that group is how hungry they are to get on the field and earn a role in year 2, because most of them either did not burn their red shirt or only played in certain situations that certainly did not mirror what they did in high school, which obviously a lot of freshmen go through that experience. That's not uncommon to this group or anything like it, but certainly that's going to be a class 2024 that is eager to carve out its role, and it might have to fend off some guys from this class of 2025 to do so.
Are there
both
guys
on offense and defense?
Are there guys on the 2024 roster, Tyseer Denmark aside, Cooper Cousins, I think the obvious ones. Are there any?
Well, no Denmark. We might as well just end the show. I did enjoy getting to talk to him, though. I will say that he's a very good interview. I think the more Penn State fans get to see him, interact in a public setting now that he's a second-year guy, the more the excitement will continue to build for his potential in this offense in 2025. He was a great interview, I thought, though. Back there. Yep, Matt. Matt.
Yeah, I was gonna. Sorry.
Yeah. Yep.
I was gonna get to that in a second once you kind of gave your answer there. Are there? I'm putting you on the spot here because I also haven't really looked at the redshirt freshman class to have an idea of like who's gonna fill some of those voids. But I think it's just an interesting thought of in certain positions, especially I know at receiver we're having this conversation and somebody has to step up. But there are those positions at defensive tackle. In the secondary where players have an opportunity, maybe even at linebacker, there's opportunities for guys to step in and fill a void, but that's just, there are, with as many players returning, there are not as many of them as I would have expected. I think everyone kind of expected one running back spot to be open and lo and behold, here we are, they aren't.
That's exactly right, T. Frank. So I think the same conversation maybe applies in the opposite direction when you talk about 2024 first-year players who are now second-year guys in 2025. So the reverse of that is I think I think if you were putting odds on it before the season started, most people would have thought Kobe King may have come back for another year, and maybe those odds diminished as the season went on. But I think it opens up the opportunity for Anthony Specca to take a step forward. I thought with the reps he got, he did some nice things. So he's a guy that stands out to me as one to watch this spring from that second-year group. Malachi Williams fascinates me too. Big kid who, there's going to be reps available at defensive end. So curious to see what he can do with those as, again, another class of 2024 guy that got some experience last year and put some good weight on and talked about that with us earlier this month. So he jumps out to me as well. And then, any of the skill position guys, right? I mean, they all, will have a chance, whether it's at corner, whether it's receiver, to find a role on the field. Obviously, it goes without saying, at receiver, it'll be a little bit easier based on where that room stands at the start of spring practice in terms of pretty much everyone, except for Liam Clifford, having a clean slate. And, of course, some of the second-year guys had some work as well, but maybe not as much as expected, especially as it relates to Denmark. So, the secondary will always be a position to keep an eye on with the way Penn State rotates there and the fact that, you lose Jalen Reed and KJ Winston. There will be opportunity there. And corner's a spot we've seen where they're not afraid to play young players they think are ready for some kind of role. So,
which brings up John Mitchell and Kenny Wosley. Yep. Who another guy who I thought played really, really well in limited snaps last year and has that sort of hunger that it's not just about desire, right? It's not just about your want to play. It's about your desire to know more about football, to get better, and to take that desire and apply it to your work ethic and learning the game and all those things. And for people who can pick it up quickly, because not everyone can pick things up the same way. Not everyone learns the same way or at the same rate. But he's a guy that I think has an opportunity as well as somebody who's very bright and very aggressive and has that chip on his shoulder for being 5'9", 5'10", and everyone doubting the fact that he can play outside corner. He was a guy that I enjoyed talking to because I think he had a kind of a really good perspective on what it takes to be good at football and to progress quickly, which is what everybody wants. Everyone wants the shiny new object of the young player to play quickly so that they can get the most out of them as soon as possible. Just for the podcast audience, I want to make sure that we get the whole list here of interesting weight updates for Penn State. Randy Arica, 285. Darius Dixon, 185. Tyke Hayes is bigger than most of the running backs in the room already at 210. And looking at him and him standing next to the rest of the class, he showed up big enough to play football. Kobe Howard, 185. Receiver size, not as much of a thing unless you're Matt Otten, who is 205. Alex Tash, 215. And Michael Troutman, 285 pounds, again, at 6'1". So that's a dense 285 there. Matt Otten came up in the chat, of course, because everyone wants a way for him to be on the field. I got something for this a little bit later in the show when we get into redesigning the offense, because I think that there's a way for them to incorporate him and not change too much in the offense to give him some of those opportunities.
Yeah, he is an interesting, anytime we talk about receivers, doesn't really matter what age they are, whether they're transfers, whether they're first-year guys, whether they're second-year guys. They almost all of them can be someone's solution to all that ailed the Penn State pass game in 2024, which is, of course, why we spend so much time talking about it during the 2025 offseason. A couple other roster notes to take care of before we move on to thoughts on how Penn State can build its 2025 offense. LeVar Arrington II will wear number 11, the next Nittany Lion to do so. He comes to Penn State, of course, in the class of 2025. King Mack returning to Penn State, not wearing his previous number 9. He is now number 16 because Elliot Washington is number 9. But the LeVar Arrington thing certainly is what we referred to earlier when we talked about making headlines about who the next number 11 would be. Comes with high expectations, obviously, not just because his dad wore it, but because what the players who have worn it since have accomplished. And so he will be the next number 11 at Penn State.
So I struggle with this conversation because on one hand, I really don't care.
Right.
It's cool. Yeah. It's a
great February football story. It's the simplest way to boil it down. Yep.
Right. So it's a fan love fest. And like from our perspective of, being the guys that talk about the things that aren't the emotions, essentially from my perspective of what matters on the field, what matters from tactics and all those things. Like it is so far down the list of things that are interesting to me, but it is also something that Penn State and everyone cares about. So it does mean something. And there are so many parts of this conversation that make no sense to me. First off, let's have this conversation, Greg. Is 11 a defensive end number or a linebacker number?
It's a linebacker number, but that's a great question. And I think one that's... Yeah,
is it really a linebacker number? Because look at all the players that have worn it and what position they play either here or in the NFL.
Right. No, it's a fair question. But when you have, what was my favorite number from last year's roster? I'm going to need a site to look that up. I'll circle back to that. But is this the next part of the conversation? I think is why is edge capitalized on a depth chart? Some people get wound up about that in the same breath. But
sometimes I uppercase edge the whole way instead of, I don't know.
Yes. No, it's a fair question. Is it a defensive end or a linebacker number? Well, it's a linebacker number now. So I certainly understand your point, though, and it's interesting that the number game, and this is peak February podcasting and YouTubing, but the number game, there's guys that have numbers these days that are not equivalent to what we've long, become accustomed to. And the one that I just can't think of at the moment is driving me crazy, but it will come to mind. But you do have a tight end, Khalil Dinkins, wearing 16. Like, how many tight ends have we seen in that number over the years?
Yeah.
But there was one in particular that sticks out to me that I cannot think of. But yeah, somebody else in the chat, I can't believe it took so long to come up, quite frankly. But he said, I'm more worried about what the other number 11 does this year. That, of course, is Kyron Hudson, the newcomer Penn State transfer edition from USC. So, Rob, I think that continuing our annual Wednesday tradition of getting to the receivers within the first half of the show, no matter how we design this. Yes, no matter how we. I wasn't even done.
I wasn't even done with the LeVar conversation. I can tell it stinks.
Yes,
I can tell it stinks because nobody wants to have it. But it's an interesting thing that if you make things matter, and yes, Kyron Hudson, the receiver, is like very important. The way it's been decided about who wears 11, I also find very arbitrary. Because what is the meaning of it? Because before it was who is talented enough to wear the number and who is going to be the next great at Penn State. And now it's hereditary. Like it's just the king has bequeathed it upon his son, and we the lowly serfs will accept this divine decision. And I don't know how I feel about that. Like just from a general perspective of like who gets to wear the best defensive player number. And it's just like, well, it's going to be LeVar Arrington II. And ultimately, again, I don't really care, but it is, and he may be good enough to play and wear and represent that and be all of those things that Penn State wants him to be, that his dad wants him to be, that Micah Parsons wants him to be. I'm not saying he's not, but there is a very different feel about this particular one than there was about Micah Parsons or Abdul Carter. And so it just all feels like I'm taking something that's fun for fans and I'm trying to make it logical. And I can already tell that I'm ruining it. Because yes, Steven says Salty T Frank. Again, I don't care. I'm pointing out the inconsistencies and I want somebody to explain to me how all of this works and what the point of all of it is, when the point of all of it is, well, his daddy wore 11, so he's going to wear 11. But the whole conversation has been about like the heritage of the number and like the play and the performance. And here we are like, all right, it goes to his kid because it's his kid. And again, ultimately, it doesn't matter whatsoever. But I just find all of this inconsistency inconsistent.
I look forward to the rage you have next year when they pick the wrong new number 0 once Dom DeLuca is forced to finally give it up. Yeah, there we go. Eggman's on the same page as me. Yes.
There we go.
Yes, I look forward to that conversation when it's the wrong pick. But no, so that was definitely the highlight of at least from the discussion standpoint, the roster update. Penn State will have new updates out, heights, weights, and all that good stuff a little bit later this year as we approach spring practice. But T-Frank, any final thoughts before we roll forward into the second half of the show?
So hopefully I have more important things to say on the second half of the show. It's just that, here's the thing. That has always, that's been rattling around in my head for a while now. And so, I just needed to say it out loud. I just needed to express that thought. So I appreciate everyone indulging that for a little bit. The last thing is, so just to point out where some of these numbers are for Penn State on the roster, Max Granville told us he's 245 pounds. He's listed right now at 229. So, if you see any of these things and you're concerned, or if you want to know some of that stuff, BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. When we went and we talked to those redshirt freshmen, Donnie Harbor, he dropped some weight. He's leaner. He's still plenty big, but there are, I think, positive development signs, positive growth signs that we talked about for this group that are already in the works. And so, just to underscore the point of this conversation, it's fine that a LeVar Arrington Jr. or the second is wearing 11. And the numbers on the roster aren't indicative of where they are. The end.
It's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle. It's BWI Live, Wednesday, February 19th. Rolling into the second half of today's show, we're going to talk about how Penn State redesigns its offense in 2025. Not a whole lot of thought needs to be given as to why this topic comes up in the middle of February, because Tyler Warren is about to go do big things at the NFL Combine next week, one of 5 Penn State players who will be in Indianapolis for that. And that, of course, means beyond the fact that Penn State lost Trey Wallace and Amari Evans to the transfer portal without, going, I don't need to go into great detail here to tell you that obviously Tyler Warren takes a great deal of production with him, despite Nick Singleton and Katron Allen being back. So let me have you, T. Frank, set up this conversation, and then we're going to get into a little bit of what things could look like beyond the obvious of, just hand the ball off to Nick Singleton and Katron Allen because they're back 55, 70 times a game. There's some more new. We're going to get into some more beyond that.
Yeah, of course it's me. We're not going to be talking about the obvious stuff. We're going to go into the corners and we're going to dig around and find what we can when it comes to the offense and kind of the underlying principles of what they were trying to do last year, where they were good, where they maybe struggled, and how they can improve some of the concepts and the core beliefs in Andy Kotelnicki's offense. So the way this sets up is Andy Kotelnicki he believes in redesigning the offense every single year to fit the talent as best as it is currently expressed, and not, here's my offense, you have to fit into it. Now, with that said, there are things he believes in. There are principles and there are even schemes and plays that are important to making all of this work. And they are going to be there year to year. At least they have been since he got to Kansas. And so that's where we're starting from. There are a lot of players returning, Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. What are they good at? What was Penn State most efficient with last year? And then how can you accent and embellish those to generate more explosive plays and get more players involved within those concepts? So that's where I started with. This isn't going to be they need to run X concept more. That's a little too nuanced. These are more high-level ideas, general principles about what they were doing and maybe what they weren't doing as much as what I expected. And it's by the way, this is an incomplete list. I have 4 ideas here. I'm going to write about this, get you into the nitty-gritty details of some of the numbers and some of the things that back that up later this week. And this is just a first iteration. There's plenty of other things that will be involved in the kind of reshaping of the offense. So this is just a starting point, because it's something I've been thinking about, Greg, for about a month, and I haven't really been able to put all the words and thoughts to it. So I just started, and here we are. We're doing it on the show.
So Penn State will obviously return a lot up front, especially, along its offensive line. Obviously, it returns plenty at tight end, but not its most productive. Yeah, I saw that too. I wondered if you wanted to point that out in the chat. Christian says outside zone with a lot of exclamation points. We'll talk about that here in a second. But with what Penn State's returning up front, and what it needs to break in at receiver. The first point you want to make here, T. Frank, is a question of could Penn State lean into jet sweeps? And I may be generalizing that point a little bit too much, but the point you're trying to make is potentially adding more, different kinds of stress to a defense compared to what we saw last year.
Okay, so it actually, this starts it off. Christian's right, outside zone, baby. That's what this offense is built around, is stretching the defense laterally with an aggressive run scheme that runs to the sideline, right? And so if you're running one way, a good way to then shred the defense, rip it apart, is to have somebody coming out the backside. Something they did last year. Like, this is not anything new, but it's about leaning into those tendencies and maybe adding players into different roles than were there previously. So let's give you an example. Quentin Martin was the jet sweep guy in a lot of these situations with that outside zone. What if this year it's Matt Otten? Now he's a receiver, 205 pounds. We know he can break tackles. And then Nick Singleton is the base runner in the scheme. So now you have explosive both ways. And I know Katron Allen, Nick Singleton, they're going to be in the backfield together. We're going to have that conversation. Now, like, Katron Allen and or Nick Singleton is the lead blocker, and you've got Matthew Otten coming out the back of this offense. That adds a dynamism, right? That adds a schism to what the defense needs to pay attention to. And then, on top of that, do you have the quarterback run game as a part of this whole conversation? Because that's an area where I think they need to find a solve. What we're trying to solve for here is the quarterback was generally not an addition into this idea, this concept of the offense goes one way, the quarterback has the option out the back door. Bo Pribula, 9 carries for 94 yards. That's what you were looking for. Drew Eller, on this particular concept, 3 carries all season long. So where are you adding in the explosiveness? Where are you adding in the you can't be rightness of this particular concept, which is core and important to the explosiveness? Because Nick Singleton and Katron Allen in this system by the end of the season were generating chunks of yardage. And it's not going to be 100% of the offense, but when you get to it, how do you make more players more explosive in this offense? It's more, to me, about the option side of this than it is the base run scheme, because that's in a certain way, it's going to take care of itself where they're going to get theirs. But if you start adding guys that are coming out of the backfield or on these jet sweeps and they're viable options to break tackles one-on-one in space, then that opens up even more explosive plays for Katron Allen and Nick Singleton. Let me give you an example. And I know I'm kind of like churning through this at a high rate and rambling here, but when you run this option play and you are bringing, again, I'm just going to use Matthew Otten as a receiver specifically, but Quentin Martin, you can put him in this conversation as well. When you are doing that, the defense has to make a choice about contain. So there are only so many players that can cover the jet sweep. Is it the corner in man coverage? Is it a safety rotation where you're bringing the safety in the middle of the field down to cover that motion player onto the side of the field he's motioned to? If you take the safety away, suddenly you have a corner that has to replace him. So you are now giving Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, if they get to the final player, the unblocked player in the scheme, that's now a corner. And then you have a safety that has to chase Matthew Otten at an angle. That's not a good opportunity for most defenses. So this is where a lot of this was built last year. Like, this is classically where I think Andy Kotelnicki's offense really does the best work, but they didn't have anybody on these jet sweeps or on these pop passes or any of those things that really was dangerous. That was really dangerous. Nick Singleton was that guy for the offense, but it didn't necessarily hit the same way. I think partially because he's best within the run scheme, and they need somebody who's really good in space with speed. Singleton, we all know, not necessarily the guy that is shifty and creative in space. They have more options, I think, this year of guys that are shifty and creative in space. Here's a guy I haven't even brought up, Corey Smith. You know, another guy who's got speed and creativity and making guys miss. So I think just generally leaning into jet sweeps a little bit more. I'm curious to see if that's something they add this year.
Next up on your list, tempo in the run game. This was something we saw used in a variety of ways during Penn State's run to the college football playoff semifinal. Also in that game, Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, both as healthy, or certainly Singleton as healthy as he was maybe all year coming down the stretch there. And so tempo in the run game. What can Andy Kotelnicki do with that to make this offense different than it was in 2024?
So the first thing is this already happened. So I'm saying like replicate this. This was really good because there's a little bit of situational problems here where they didn't do this early in the year because they didn't need to. And then secondarily, because Anthony Donko is hurt. And you can't run bilaterally if your right tackle can't block with the left side of his body. Because then you just can't run in the B gap. Like that didn't work for them. So when Nolan Rucci came in and played really well, and was able to allow them to run in either direction. It allowed them to use this tempo more often. I think they just need to lean into that, where you can run the same exact outside zone concept. Now you can run it left or right out of different formations with different players, making it present like a new play on that up tempo, but you're running the same play. Everyone on the offense should know exactly what they're doing. It's just who's in which position. And then if we fold in the whole jet sweep idea of different guys carrying the ball, I would be curious to see what happens if you go up tempo then into a wildcat, where now you've got that quarterback option, but it's Katron Allen, Nick Singleton, Quentin Martin. This is how you get all these young running backs involved, by the way. This is how you get all these tertiary players. I'm trying to satisfy the bloodlust of the chat of how do you get Matthew Otten, how do you get Quentin Martin involved in the game, use their specific strengths, build around packages around these players, not the whole offense. Let's not move him to slot receiver if you're talking about Quentin Martin, but let's use his athleticism and his multiplicity to actually line him up in the slot and then use him as a slot receiver or primarily as a running back, getting the ball out of the backfield. So these are different ways that I think Penn State could do that, and they need to. Like, they need to add in this defense breaking idea of putting speed into space. They didn't necessarily have enough speed that was good at the line of scrimmage to craft an offense that was, like breaking defenses in a way that everyone could see and made them look silly. There is an element of this offense that happened at Kansas that I didn't quite see show up last year. I think they have the potential with a reset now to have more of a mix of those players, because you're not funneling the offense 140 receptions, 20 rushes, couple of passes through a tight end. And so, like, I think there's more opportunity here with some of these things. And that's where I'm starting with the run game specifically. That's where on that side, I think they can engineer some of these things while still maintaining they're going to run the same offense. A lot of this stuff is going to remain the same. These are just the areas I think they can complement and tweak what they did last year to improve.
Yeah, it makes the spring interesting, but it makes that early September portion of the schedule, the non-conference portion of the 2025 regular season, so interesting, because Penn State will be, obviously, it should be in position to mix and match in any real way it desires to at that point of the season before it hosts Oregon at the end of September to kick off the first month of the season. So some of this stuff you're talking about, maybe it'll show up in that first 3-game stretch, and maybe it won't show up till the end of the month based on the level of competition. But it does sound like things that, to your point, should stick around, could be added. And, to your point about the running backs room, it's just a situation where, any way you can get the ball, spread the touches around as much as possible. You're going to rely on Nick Singleton and Katron Allen when it's, push comes to shove. But you certainly are going to want to get those other guys involved, and this is potentially one way to do so.
Yeah, and so it's not just jet sweeps or these up-tempo areas. It's this is something that they did at Kansas, and partially this is because they didn't have a quarterback and a passing game that was consistent throughout the year, but this is also indicative of the way that Andy Kotelnicki is creative when he feels like he has 3 running backs to use, which is whether it's an end around, whether it's using just using somebody other than Tyler Warren in the same concepts might yield a different result because it's a different skill set, different talent. And so that's playing off of those ideas. But anything they did last year, just putting a different player in that position, I think also provides an opportunity for a different dynamic in that particular part of the game.
Let's get the chat involved here as we move on to our next topic. I think this is a fair segue. Z-Man asks, Drew Aller ran better last year, but room for improvement for sure. Your next topic, T-Frank, is the RPO throws. Penn State had one of the highest RPO percentages last season, but one of the lowest throw percentages on those RPOs. So let's start with the first part of that in terms of Drew Aller's rushing ability, just in general. So let's look at the numbers again. He had 74 rushes in 2023, his first year as a starter, for 210 yards, 4 touchdowns, and averaged 2.8 yards per carry. Last year, it was 96 for 302 and 6 touchdowns, 3.1 yards per carry. So before we get into, because this is obvious, I think goes hand in hand with the RPO throw percentage and Drew Aller's number of carries to an extent, except for the sneaks, things like that. But is there room for improvement in his running game? And is there an area where Penn State could maybe reduce some of the need for him to run with more throws off these RPOs?
So just to kind of put some context to those numbers, 321 of those yards were scrambles. So that is not involved in the run game necessarily. And then he had under 100 designed yards in terms of he kept on a read option. And to clarify, RPO is different than read option. You can have both on the same play. A read option is you're reading the end man on the line of scrimmage and the quarterback decides to keep the ball or to hand it off to the running back. RPO is this is a run play until I get the trigger from the defense, and then I throw the ball to a receiver running a route. Everyone else is running a run play except for the quarterback and that particular receiver or a number of receivers. So just they both involve the quarterback, and they both are chained into decisions you got to make very quickly. But I'm emphasizing here of throwing the football more, of not handing the ball off as much to Katron Allen and Nick Singleton in these situations when everyone knows they're going to get the football. And part of this conversation, and I guess I'll address the Drew Aller part in the run game specifically to button that up. Then we'll move on to the passing game. I think he can improve there. Yes. If you are doing some of these things we talked about with the jet sweeps and you have a triple option essentially at the handoff, and he's the third threat for the defense to contend with, by definition, he should have more running yards. If that's his decision, he should be wide open for 7 yards. And that, these numbers should be easy and they should be free, because now you're putting better situation for him to make that decision. And he's got to be decisive to keep the ball at the right time. There are a lot of things that the defense can do to make you wrong by bringing 11 down in the box and having somebody for everybody. That's where the offense coordinator has to not be obvious with when you do this, right? Not lean into this and not give the running backs and the run game 80% of your attention. That's where I think we need to make sure that everyone, I saw Wobble saying you could build around the offense, around the receiver or the running backs, or I'm a riot. If you're 100% of the attention is going to the running backs, then 100% of the defense attention is going to go to the running back. And it's all in this box, in this small area of the field. This is about spreading out the field. And so those rushing yards for Drew Aller should be easy at that point. And then if you've got a dynamic runner in this offense, it becomes these are seam explosive runs that are devastating to a defense. And I don't think they need to be that, but they do need to be good decisions, easy yards, and kind of a predictable part of the diet of 2 or 3 times a game, he's getting those yards. Now let's talk about the RPO. So if your offense is so aggressively tailored to the running backs and the run game, this is where I think it's interesting that despite that, I think teams still played a good number of too high defenses and didn't give these RPO opportunities, but they were there. The RPO opportunities is you're running a slant. I think to be more aggressive with the RPOs is what I'm talking about here, not just to throw it more, because every RPO is a decision. And so it is a decision that the defense dictates to you. I haven't gone through every single one of Aller's decisions last year because there's a lot of them, but I have a feeling there was a couple of 50-50 chances, and he's reading the situation and it says to throw, and maybe he gave anyway, and it might have been a good decision because they got yards, but we're talking about how do you enhance the passing game. And so I think being more aggressive generally with the RPOs is a way to get the passing game some easy layups. And that's an area where I think that's just a simple fix in my mind of throwing the ball more in these 50-50 situations that will help your offense out quite a bit. But it is the decision is based on what the defense does. You can't just decide because then you're just throwing a pass play.
T. Frank, we got one more point to get to here, and for those who are not aware how we put down our podcast rundown, we always make sure that you guys have to wait to hear about anything related to the receivers. Sometimes you force our hand, but we always make sure to draw you back in right about this time of the show. Your last point here is involved wide receivers more on early downs. You have some interesting facts about the Penn State offense last year, how it went about doing that, and how that could potentially change this year, and why it would be a good reason to do so.
So this directly ties into the previous point, and that's also why I stacked it this way of throw up more RPOs.
I'm not accepting that. I'm not accepting that. Fair. Yeah.
But also target receivers more on these RPOs, which if you're running a skinny post to a receiver running an RPO that's one-on-one into the boundary or wherever, how you stack this, because Andy Kotelnicki can distort the defensive structure with motions and shifts and formations. You can get one-on-ones, and you can get a receiver with the opportunity to break a tackle and get a game-changingly explosive play. So that's the first half of this, of I think involve them in RPOs, and that should provide some easier chunk play opportunities. I'm a fan of this idea. This is kind of what the Texas offense is built around. They go hard after this idea of creating these dynamically aggressive down the field RPO situations, but they haven't necessarily been able to put it all together the same way that they did at Alabama under Steve Sarkisian. So that's one half of it. And that's where I think a guy like Kyron Hudson, who's not the fastest guy in the world, but is a tenacious receiver to get a one-on-one opportunity, run a route, catch a ball, and maybe break a tackle, or at least just catch the football, not be bullied at the catch point. But this is the thing, to pivot from that of the RPO conversation to involving the receivers. I want to give credit to Landon Tangwall, who brought this up earlier this offseason about the involvement of the receivers. It's not just about the number of plays. It's about when and the quality of those opportunities early in the game and on early downs. So here's a stat for you. If you want Nick Singleton to be more involved in the passing game, the running game, or the running backs to be more involved in the passing game, last year Nick Singleton was involved on more early down passes at a higher rate than Trey Wallace. That means first and second down. Nick Singleton got a higher percentage of targets than Trey Wallace. I don't think you want that. I think you want that. I don't think you want that. So doesn't matter if it's Devontae Ross, doesn't matter if it's Kyron Hudson, doesn't matter if it's Matthew Wadden, doesn't matter if it's everyone's favorite idea of making Andrew Olish a receiver and having another 4-6 receiver out there that doesn't actually fit the bill of an explosive big play threat. Target receivers early on downs, get them involved in the passing game, and build confidence in that group of players. I don't, and I want to make this clear, it sounds like a criticism, I don't blame Andy Kotelnicki for throwing the football to his best football players. But there's a reset now. Tyler Warren is not coming back. You have the opportunity to reset the personality of the passing game in a big way, and I think this is a starting point. Involving the receivers on early downs and allowing them to work for the offense and get into the game before conversion downs, before third and long, where everything's just by definition harder. And so you then blame them for high leverage situations where it didn't really work.
Yeah.
Third down didn't work. And now, Trey Wallace is a bum in the chat once again, when maybe it wasn't necessarily the fairest situation, that he didn't get a lot of those targets that were kind of the gimmies and the layups that Tyler Warren was getting because you wanted him to catch the ball and break a tackle and run. It's a chicken or an egg situation. Did they earn it is the other question. Did they earn that position in the offense? Clearly not last year. So do these receivers earn that? And that's, I think, a big part of what I think they can do to retool this offense.
Well, you heard there from Thomas Frank Carr some ideas on how Penn State can retool and redesign and build its offense in 2025. We have a few minutes left here on BWI Live. If you have any questions for T. Frank, you can throw them in the chat now. We'll get to those. You can read about all of this in a much more in-depth level over at BWI this week. T. Frank, can you tell our listeners who are going to take a moment to like and subscribe here at the YouTube channel before they leave their comment or their question for us, how they can subscribe at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com?
Yeah, I don't know how we didn't get to this. This is a failure on my part once again, that we didn't get to the fact that they have a $1 deal going on right now in perpetuity. This is how it works. Before we had told you, like, you sign up for a week, you get it for $1. You can decide it's a tryout period, right? Then you sign up for a year. Now, the $1 is what you pay every week for a full year. That is an insane deal compared to what the full price is for a year, and then what you would be paying $1 a week. Greg, I can afford that subscription. I don't know about you, but I can afford that subscription without any thought. Like, that's an automatic yes. And so if you want to go to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, you can sign up right now for that deal.
Penn State is moving through the month of February. There's a lot going on in the recruiting world. The gang will all be here tomorrow on Thursday, February 20th, for a latest installment of the recruiting show. We'll have wrestling here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel. You can check out Cale Sanderson's final regular season news conference from Tuesday, and we'll have coverage over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com and also a wrestling show here on the YouTube channel. T. Frank, any final thoughts as we roll down the home stretch here? It is a time of year where the foundation is being laid. If you check out Penn State social media channels, the guys are in the weight room lifting. Mm-hmm. It won't be long before the winter workout warriors of the day start popping up. I want to make a note about that, actually, thinking about the conversations we had last week. I asked a number of the second-year guys, because I know this has come up on the chat before. It's definitely come up on social media, and it's come up in the Lions Den over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. This idea that the competitors of the day, that the coaching staff, each assistant tweets out, does it matter, does it not? It could have just been lip service, but there was not a lot of hesitation when asking those second-year players whether or not those matter to those guys. They do. They're motivators. They pay attention. And so I thought that was interesting. Those are coming out soon. And before we know it, spring practice is going to be here. So any final thoughts?
Yeah, so I guess the part of this show and part of this conversation is, who are you building the offense around? And it's obvious it's Katron Allen and Nick Singleton. And the offensive line. I think, we can't forget you're building this around the offensive line because they can be a strength of this team. But from the receiver or the passing game perspective, I hope this is a fair comment. I hope this is, because I've been trying to find a right way to say this offseason, and I had this thought around the Minnesota game, I want to say last year. The offense last year was built around Tyler Warren. And I mean that to say, everyone said, no duh, but it wasn't built around Drew Aller. Yes, you build your offense and your passing game around the quarterback. Everyone does that. You're not going to do things he physically can't do. But were you accentuating Drew Aller's strengths, or are you accentuating getting the ball to Tyler Warren? Again, the decision was obvious. Tyler Warren is the best tight end in the country, the best receiver on the team. You want to get him the football. Design this offense around Drew Aller. And Drew Aller developed to the point that in these high leverage situations, you're the guy who's going to find the open receiver. Because generally, and he's even said this, generally there's somebody open on every play in college football. You don't have to force the ball to just one player. Now that the offense is not slanted one way towards a player, there is this reset. I think it's a refresh and opportunity for the offense to be built around the passing game. And that means built around Drew Aller. And I hope that makes sense. I hope that is something that is an opportunity and not a criticism. Because all of these things, I can't what I'm always concerned with is people taking my words and deriving their own meaning from them. I heard Drew Aller wasn't good enough last year. That's not what I'm saying. This year, that's what I'm hoping for, is the opportunity for this passing game to be built around the quarterback and the concepts generally. And again, that's even an unfair statement because it was last year, but just more of that emphasis on Aller's abilities to find the right receiver and push the ball down the field.
We shall see how that all works out. We'll get our first glimpse of that at spring practice next month. One thing from the chat, quick. We do not have a dance team. Now, you would not want T. Frank or I at Thon dancing, but we do wish the best of luck to everyone supporting that cause at Penn State this weekend. Yeah, you would not want us there. That would cost donations, I would think. So we will not be on hand dancing for that. But I think that'll do it, T. Frank, for this edition of the BWI Live Show. We will be back again with a recruiting episode here on the channel Thursday. You can get the latest recruiting info as it happens, and it's happening quite frequently as official visit setting season is here. That's like the NFL. I'm not sure what the NFL version is, but there was a guy that works for the NFL that tweeted out their calendar, all their dates of things that happen, and some of it you look at and you're like, well, that's kind of inconsequential. But and that's kind of where we're at. Like it's very important that obviously Penn State spends the time now to set up their official visits for later this year. But it's just one of those things you think of on the calendar and you're like, yeah, does that really matter? And then when those guys show up and commit and everyone here gets excited, that time of year kind of mattered. So check that stuff out over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, where, as T. Frank said, it's $1 a week for a year, where you can join us for Penn State getting ready for the start of the 2025 spring practices, and then later the college football season, which is a little bit down the road as I linger here to find our outro music. There we go. So that's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle from Blue White Illustrated, BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Thank you all for joining us. We will talk to you next time here on the BWI YouTube channel. Have a good day.